Greetings. I'm so excited to be with all of you in India today. Again, thank you to Pastor Joe and Susan. I'm so grateful to be able to be a part of what is going on in your congregation. We just appreciate all of you so much. And as I said before, I am so hoping to see you soon, sometime this next year. Well, one of the things that I wanted to talk about is end times, things that are happening right now, how we need to be prepared. One of the first things I always want everyone to know, if you're living on the beach of an ocean and there was a huge earthquake, a magnitude of 10, and there is a giant tsunami that is headed right for your coast, whatever you had prepared isn't going to help when the tsunami hits. There are some things that when it comes to preparation, we need to literally be spiritually prepared more than anything else. Like with an earthquake, you might prepare by attaching things to the wall that you don't want to have fall off. But when that big earthquake hits, all the preparations in the world may not help. I know many people are storing up lots of food and water. Well, guess what? If a nuclear bomb hits close to your house, it isn't going to help. Or if you have to flee because something is happening in your neighborhood, you're going to have to leave all the goods behind when you flee. So while making preparations physically are good, the number one thing you have to do is to prepare your hearts before God. I've almost died so many times. I've lost count. I've had guns at my head several times. I was in major car accidents, major medical malpractice, almost eaten by lions. And the thing that we have to settle in on, the Lord has already numbered your days. If it's not your time, it's not going to happen. And if it is your time, there's nothing you can do about it. Therefore, what we have to do is just make sure we are right with God, we're in a good relationship with Him, and then it really doesn't matter. But with that said, people need to be prepared spiritually and somewhat physically. Do what you can do. That's what's most important. But I want to touch on that from another perspective. And the thing that I think is so important, that is definitely an end times book that isn't taught, is the Song of Songs. Yes, the Song of Songs is very prophetic, and it's been taught wrong by the church for millennia. They don't understand what it is really about, and it's about the last days. Now, one of the things, and how I want to begin this, I have to lay a little bit of a foundation before I really go into it. And what is this? God's goal has always been to reach His people, and He uses as many ways as He can. For example, in Ezekiel 34, verse 31, it says, "And you are my sheep, the sheep of my pasture are men, and I am your God, says the Lord God." Okay, so here we're known as sheep. Other places we're known as fish. And so there's all different ways that God is trying to communicate to us so we can understand. That's why sometimes He comes across as our Father, as our King, as our Shepherd. We all have different relationships with God, and He wants to relate to you. Now, here's the other thing. God was known to Israel as their shepherd long before He was ever known to them as their king. Listen to Psalms 80. verse 1. It says, "Give ear, O shepherd of Israel, you that lead Joseph like a flock, you dwell between the cherubims, shine forth." This is quoting a verse back in Genesis where God tells Israel, or I would say Jacob, whose name became Israel, called God his shepherd. And so in Genesis, God was known as Jacob/Israel's shepherd. He wasn't known as Israel's king until about 400 years later. And this is why we read in Psalm 23, verse 1 through 3, "The Lord is my shepherd. He makes me to lie down in green pastures. He leads me by still waters. He restores my soul." Okay, well, in Genesis 49, and it is in verse 24, listen to this. Jacob is blessing the 12 tribes, and he comes to Joseph, and he says, "His bow abode in strength, and the arms of his hands were made strong by the hands of the mighty God of Jacob. From there is the shepherd, the stone of Israel." So we see God was known as the shepherd of Israel long before he was known as their king. Now, we also know when it comes to the shepherds, there were good shepherds and there were bad shepherds. We see this in Ezekiel 34, verse 2, where it says, "Son of man, prophesy against those shepherds of Israel and tell them, thus says the Lord God to the shepherds, woe to them who feed themselves instead of feeding the flock." The responsibility is to feed the flock. This is why in the Gospel of John, toward the end, 3 times he tells Peter, "Feed my sheep, feed my sheep, feed my sheep." Okay, they weren't to be like the Gentiles who wanted to lord over the flock. But no, the shepherds were to feed his sheep. Now, I want you to remember what God told Nathan concerning David wanting to build a house. Here it says, "Go and tell David my servant, so says the Lord, you are not to build me the house, because I've not dwelt in the house since the very day that I brought up Israel. But I've gone from tent to tent, from one tabernacle to another. Wherever I've walked in all of Israel, did I ever tell any of the judges whom I commanded to feed my people, saying, why haven't you built me a house? So you go tell my servant David, so says the Lord of hosts, I took you from the pasture, from following the sheep, so that you could be ruler over my people Israel." Well, the number one thing you need to know, David was a shepherd long before he became king. Solomon was never a shepherd. He was born with a silver spoon in his mouth. He didn't have the training of a shepherd, and he did not have the heart of a shepherd. Now, in this book, the Song of Songs, you're going to see a big battle happening between 3 individuals. You're going to have Solomon, the king. There's going to be a shepherd boy and the would-be bride. And she is trying to decide who she should follow. Should she stay with Solomon as king, or should she follow this shepherd boy who she doesn't know hardly anything about? Now, you also have to remember the difference between a melech and a king, which is the English word for melech. Typically, when you think of a king, you think of someone who is demanding of his people, who's taxing them, who's abusing them, some kind of a dictator. But a melech is someone who only accepts volunteers. They don't force anyone to follow them. They let them decide if they want to follow them. Okay, well, to get the most out of this story in the Song of Songs, we need to know exactly who is talking. But what this book is about, the actual plot, is God is trying to woo his bride away from wanting a human king back to him as being their shepherd king. Now, we see in Hosea chapter 13, verse 10, God says, where's your king now that he can save you? And your judges of whom you said, give us a king. And then God says, look, I gave you a king in my anger, and I took him away in my wrath. God was angry that Israel wanted a king. We see that in 1 Samuel 8, 5 through 9, where Israel tells Samuel, we want a king like all of the nations. And Samuel tells the Lord, and the Lord tells Samuel, well, listen to what they say, but make sure you protest solemnly and tell them what a human king is going to be like. He's going to tax you. He's going to take 1/10 of your vineyards and give it to his officers. Well, in 1 Samuel 8, 19 and 20, the people refuse to obey the voice of Samuel, and they said, no, we want a king like all the nations. And so what we find here in the Song of Songs, it's really about God wooing Israel away from a human king back to himself as their shepherd king. And Solomon was supposedly the epitome of a human king, the most wisest there was, and yet he was the stupidest there was, and I will prove it to you. Here the king wants Shulamite to stay in the castle with him, but she's being pulled away by this shepherd. And there's no way in this story that King Solomon could also be the shepherd. He was never a shepherd, but the Messiah was. As a matter of fact, when you look at the Song of Songs, chapter 1, verse 4, she says, the king has brought me into his chambers. So she knows who the king is. She knows what his job is. All right, she knows this very well. But look what happens a few verses later in verse 7. She's speaking to the shepherd, and she says, tell me, O you, whom my soul loves, where do you feed, and where do you make your flock to rest at noon? Wow, here she claims to love him, but has absolutely no idea where he works. All right, and notice it's where he lets his flock rest at noon. She doesn't want to help him with his work. She wants to come at lunchtime and be the focus of everything he's doing. This is ridiculous. All right. Now, here is the other thing. What this book is actually it's a prophetic love story of the Messiah who's trying to woo his bride back to fulfill her calling and being one with him and working that harvest together. So the way you know who is talking, the bride-to-be or the Shulamite always refers to the shepherd as my beloved. We see that in the Song of Songs, chapter 5, verse 4, where she says, my beloved put his hand by the latch of the door, my heart yearned for him. So my beloved is her talking about the shepherd. We see this in Song of Songs chapter 2, verse 10, where she says, my beloved spoke and said to me, and look at his response, rise up, my love, my fair one, and come away. So we know she's speaking when she calls him my beloved, and he's speaking when he calls her my love. Now, I can't tell you how important it is to understand this text. You'll see why in a little bit. What's interesting is in the first section of the Song of Songs, the bride does all the talking, which is one of the big problems. The other thing that I have to mention to you is the English is totally wrong in some of these translations. Who is the one who falls asleep? The church. Who is the one who never sleeps or slumbers? God. All right. And so listen to this. We're going to begin here with the Song of Songs, chapter 1, and verse 2 through 4. He says, let him kiss me. She says, let him kiss me with the kisses of his mouth. Your love is better than wine. And she mentions how his name is as ointment poured forth, and that's why the virgins love you. She doesn't say, I love you. She doesn't even profess to love him yet. And then what do we find? She says, oh, draw me, and we will run after you. Not I will run after you. Then she mentions how the king has brought her into his chambers, so she knows who the king is. The king has brought her into his chambers. But look at what she says. We will be glad and rejoice in you. It doesn't say him. She's rejoicing in the shepherd. And she says, we will remember your love more than wine, and the upright love you. She's saying, everyone loves you, the shepherd. Now, watch what happens in verse 5 and 6. She goes, oh, I'm black. Oh, you daughters of Jerusalem, as the tents of Kedar, okay, as the curtains of Solomon. Don't look at me because I'm black, because the sun has looked upon me. My mother's children were angry with me, and they made me the keepers of the vineyards, but my own vineyard I haven't kept. The purpose here of the tents of Kedar, they were pagans, all right? And the Solomon curtains were pitch black. And she says, the sun has looked upon me. That's the S-U-N. And what's going on is the fact she's been involved with sun worship, which is what Israel was involved with for a long time. And then she admits she hasn't even been taking care of her own vineyard, which in Isaiah 5, we see Israel is the vineyard, and she's not taking care of it. And so now look at what happens in verse 7. She says, tell me, you whom I love, where you feed, where you make your flocks to rest at noon. And then she says, I just might turn aside by the flocks of your companions if you don't tell me. Oh, how arrogant. But look what happens. The daughters of Jerusalem, in verse 8, reprove her, and they say, if you don't know, O you fairest among women, why don't you follow the footsteps of the flock and feed your kids by the shepherd's tents? It says the people of this world are wiser than the people of light in the New Testament. And here we see the daughters of Jerusalem reproving the bride. And then we see in verse 9 through 11, the Messiah or the shepherd responds. And he says, I've compared you, oh, my love. That's how we know he's speaking. And he compares her to a bunch of horses in Pharaoh's chariots. Okay, now I'm not going to go through all of this. I'm just going to kind of jump through this book here. So let's take a look at this, where I want to go now, which is totally amazing. Go down to verse 15 of chapter 1. And look at what he says to her. He says, behold, you are fair, my love. You even have dove's eyes. Every woman wants the man to look here, nowhere else. Look in my eyes. And he's looking right in her eyes and says, oh, you have such beautiful eyes. They're like a dove. But look how she responds. Behold, you are fair, my beloved. Yes, pleasant. But look at this. Our bed is green. The beams of our house are cedar. Our rafters are of fir. What is this telling us? He's consumed with her, but she's consumed not with him, but with all of the benefits that he's bringing to the marriage. Oh my goodness, you're rich. I want to marry you. She doesn't love him. She loves what she's getting out of this relationship. Now I have to point out, she says, our bed is green. Well, keep an eye on. Remember that. Now, here we go on to chapter 2, and I want to jump to verse 6. This is where a mistranslation is in English. And here it says, in verse 6, his left hand is under my head. So who's speaking? The Shulamite, the bride. And if his left hand is under her head and his right hand is embracing her, she is laying down. She's like on the sofa. She's laying down, and his left hand is under her head and his right hand is embracing her. Okay, well, look at what happens here. Then comes the shepherd, and he's charging the daughters of Jerusalem. And he says, by the roes and the hinds of the field, do not stir up nor awake my love, okay, until he please. What do you mean, he please? He's not the one who went to sleep. She was. We know he's talking because it says, my love. And so the word he please is incorrect. It's until she please. So the shepherd is telling the daughters of Jerusalem, don't you go waking her up until she please. This is huge. And then what do we find? She hears the voice of her beloved. We know she's speaking because she says, the voice of my beloved, behold, he is coming, leaping on the mountains, skipping upon the hills. And she says, my beloved is like a roe or a young hart. Behold, he's standing behind our wall. He looks forth at the windows. He is showing himself through the lattice. Okay, so she's in the house with all of the possessions, and she doesn't even care that he's not there. And so he's been off working the harvest, and he comes home, and the door's locked. He can't get in, and he's looking through the lattice of the windows. And listen to what he said. She says in verse 10, my beloved spoke and said to me. So what does he say to her? Rise up, my love, my fair one, and come away. So that proves to you she was the one who was sleeping. And he tells her to get up. And then he says, for lo, the winter is past, the rain is over and gone. Do you know what that means? She didn't just sleep one night. She went into hibernation. She's been sleeping for 3 months. This is the church who's been asleep forever. And what does he say? It's springtime. The flowers are appearing on the earth. The time of the singing of birds has come. The voice of the turtle dove is heard in our land. The fig tree is putting forth her green figs, and the vines with tender grapes are giving a good smell. Arise, my love, my fair one, and come away. It's amazing. Hear his heart. He should be pounding on the door saying, get up and get to work. But no, he's wooing her. And he says, please, my love, wake up and come away with me to do the work of the harvest. And then he says this, oh, my dove, you're hiding in the clefts of the rock, in the secret places of the stairs. Let me see your countenance. Let me hear your voice, for sweet is your voice and your countenance is comely. What's happening? He's come, and she doesn't want to go to work, so she's hiding in a closet. She's hiding under the stairs. She wants to be left alone so she can just love being in the house. This is horrible. And what does he end up saying to her? He says, take us the foxes, the little foxes that are spoiling the vines, for our vines have tender grapes. The foxes, according to Ezekiel, are the false prophets that are ruining the vine, which represents Israel. He's saying, I need your help. I want you to work with me. But she's hiding. And look what she actually has the audacity to say. She says in verse 17, well, until the day break and the shadows flee away, go away, my beloved. You be like a yoe or a young hart upon the mountains of Bether. That means the mountains of separation, like mountains in any country that separate one side from the other. She's telling her beloved, you go take a hike. You go work the harvest. I'm going to stay within the four walls of this nice little church, and I'm just going to stay here. And remember, I told you to remember the fact that she said, our bed is green. Look at chapter 3, verse 1. It's no longer our bed. It's now my bed. She goes, by night on my bed, I sought him whom my soul loves. I sought him, but I didn't find him. I'm going to get up now and go around the city and in the streets, in the broad ways. I will seek him whom my soul loves. I sought him, but I found him not. Oh my goodness. Here it's become her bed, not their bed. She seeks the one she loves, but she doesn't obey. She doesn't obey, but she claims to love him, and she can't find him. So where does she go? Into the broad ways. We know in the New Testament, broad is the way of destruction. She's looking all over for him and can't find him. This is what's going to happen to many in the church in these days because they haven't obeyed him when he's called. When they call, he will not answer them. And then what happens, though, the watchmen that are going around the city found her. And then she says, have you seen him whom my soul loves? And it was but a little time that she passed from them. She says, I found him whom my soul loves. I held on to him. I wouldn't let him go. All right. The moment she confesses her love for him, she's found. Here she confessed her love to others. Well, this is important, I believe, too. As children of God, as the bride of the Messiah, if we're not confessing our love to others, we're not going to find him. So then what do we have happening? Immediately, she goes to sleep again. Look at verse 5. And again, this is in chapter 3. He says, I charge you, O daughters of Jerusalem, by the roes and by the hinds of the field, that you stir not up nor awake my love until she please. Well then, what in the world happens? It says in verse 6, who is this that's coming out of the wilderness like pillars of smoke? And then she realizes it's Solomon. And it says, behold, his bed, which is Solomon's. And there's 60 men of Israel around it, of the valiant of Israel. They're all holding swords, being expert in war. Every man has his sword upon his thigh. Why? Because of fear in the night. Solomon is not a man of the day. Solomon is a man of the night. He puts his own people in danger. It's like, why is he on his bed and these soldiers, these valiant men, it's almost like he's looking for a harem. They're having to go and find what woman would be willing to sleep with him that night. Well, look at what it says. King Solomon made himself a chariot of the wood of Lebanon. He made the pillars of silver, the bottom of gold, the covering of purple. The midst thereof paid with love for who? The daughters of Jerusalem, not for Jerusalem. He's not in love with the bride, Jerusalem. He's in love with the daughters of Jerusalem, which refer to Sodom and Gomorrah and Samaria. The Jerusalem is Jerusalem. The daughters are offshoots of the cities where people move to start a new city. And then it says, you go forth, O you daughters of Jerusalem, and you behold King Solomon. I'm sticking with the shepherd. And then what do we find in chapter 4? Again, he's speaking to the bride, and he says, you are fair, my love. You have dove's eyes within your locks. And he goes through talking about how wonderful she is. And then in verse 7, she responds, well, you are all fair, my love. He's speaking, because it says my love. He says, you are all fair, my love, and there is no spot in you. Okay, and then look at what he says in verse 9. He says to her, you've ravished my heart, my sister, my spouse. You've ravished my heart with just one of your eyes. Okay, well, then let me show you this. He says to her, this is very important in verse 12. He says to her, you are like a garden that is enclosed, my sister, my spouse. You are like a spring shut up, a fountain sealed. And look how she responds. She says in verse 16, awake, O north wind, and come thou south, blow upon my garden that the spices may flow out. And then she says, let my beloved come into his garden and eat his pleasant fruits. Okay, first she calls it my garden, and then she remembers, and now she changes it to his garden, not even our garden. That's a good thing. But look how he responds in chapter 5. He goes, yes, I am coming to my garden, my sister, my spouse. I've gathered my myrrh with my spice. I've eaten my honeycomb with my honey. I've drunk my wine with my milk. Okay, God is saying, look, everything you have and are is from me. Now, watch this. Look what happens. She's speaking, and again, she's asleep. And she says in verse 2, I sleep, but my heart's waking. Well, the amazing thing, the Hebrew word for sleep here is not now I lay me down to sleep. It's sleeping in the dust of the earth word. So here she's at the point of death, okay? It's like she's about to have a heart attack, but her heart is still beating. And then she says, it's the voice of my beloved that is knocking. Well, guess what? The word knock there in Hebrew is not rap. It's to pound and to beat on the door. Like he's saying this time, get up, all right? And look at this. She says, what's the voice of my beloved that knocks? And listen to what he's saying. This time he's saying, open to me, my sister, my love, my dove, my undefiled. For my head is filled with dew and my locks with the drops of the night. He's saying it's pouring down rain. And it's not that he wants to come inside. He wants her to come out because the rain always speaks of the blessings of God. And as a matter of fact, when he says it is filled with dew, okay, his head, dew always speaks of the resurrection of the dead in the Bible. And here she's at the point of death and he's trying to resurrect her. And when he's beating on the door, it's almost like he's doing CPR, trying to get her back to life again. But look how she responds. She goes, my beloved put it in his hand by the hole of the door. Oh, my bowels were moved for him. And I rose up to open to my beloved. But look what she had to do first. She had to go put myrrh on her hands, on her fingers, sweet smelling myrrh. It says upon the handles of the lock. Not only was the door shut, it was locked and barred. Not only would you go out and spread the gospel, she wouldn't let anyone in to hear the gospel. She's not looking out of the windows, anticipating his return. No, she's fast asleep. And so she finally opens to her beloved in verse 6, and it says, but my beloved has withdrawn himself. He was gone, and my soul failed when he spake. I sought him and I could not find him. I called him, but he gave no answer. And the watchmen this time that went about the city found me. They smote me. They wounded me. And the keepers of the walls took away my veil from me. Okay. Now this time she is charging the daughters of Jerusalem. And she says, if you find my beloved, tell him that I am sick of love. Well, here's some of the things that's amazing. Again, the first time when he comes and he says, arise, my love, my fair one, and come away. The winter is past. It's springtime. that are the spring feasts, the appointed times, Passover. This time, it's the fall feasts. And here he is. It's like Yom Kippur and Yom Teruah, that time frame of the fall feast. And he's pounding on the door, trying to get his bride to be awake. But no, she's all consumed with herself. She's not in a hurry to go do what he says. And so she can't find him because when he called, she didn't answer. And this time, the watchman beat her, okay, and wounded her instead of telling her where he was. And it says they removed her veil. In other words, what they were telling her is, you're not fit to be the bride. Well, guess what happens? Right after that, the daughters of Jerusalem, when she charges them to tell her, she goes, or the daughters of Jerusalem go, well, why? What is so great about your beloved? How is he better than any other beloved, you fairest among women? You know, why do you charge us this way? Well, now the bride just feels absolutely horrible. And she is saying just how absolutely gorgeous her beloved is. She goes all the way through the end of chapter 5. And what do we find in chapter 6? They go, oh my goodness, where is your beloved gone? Where is your beloved turned aside? We want to seek him as well. Well, that's what we're supposed to be doing with the world. We're supposed to be spreading the gospel and not beating everybody up with legalism or the law type of a thing. But no, we're to show him how God's laws are good, how wonderful God is. And believe me, when we get excited about God, when we talk to people and tell them how wonderful he is, well, then they'll want to know. The problem is we haven't been presenting the gospel in the right way. And so, what do we see here? She goes, I am my beloved's, and my beloved is mine. He feeds among the lilies. Well, you know what's fascinating is look at this. She says, I am my beloved's, and my beloved is mine. Earlier in the book, she says, my beloved is mine, and I am his. Well, now she's learned her lesson, and that has switched around, and now she knows where he feeds among the lilies. And then what happens? All of a sudden, he shows up after she's been proclaiming how wonderful he was to the daughters of Jerusalem. Here he shows up, and again, he tells her how wonderful she is. And what do we find now? Instead of not wanting to work the harvest, what do we find? We see in verse 11 of chapter 6, she goes down into the garden of nuts to see the fruits of the valley and to see whether the vine flourished and the pomegranates budded. And so she's left the daughters of Jerusalem. Now she's going to work the harvest. And the daughters of Jerusalem in verse 13 say, return, return, O Shulamite, return, return, that we may look upon you. And it's amazing how the whole story of the Song of Songs is a prophecy of the end times, how the church or believers are so selfish and so self-centered, that's all they're consumed about, how we continually fall asleep. We don't want to do the work. We'll let him do the work, and we'll support him while we stay within the four walls. To all of a sudden now we are a pure bride, and now we want to go join him in the work. Now what happens as we go? Let's go to verse 10. It began with, my beloved is mine, and I am his. And then it goes to, I am my beloved's, and he is mine, switching it. And then finally, in verse 10 of chapter 7, it says, I am my beloved's, and his desires toward me. She doesn't make any claim on him. And look at verse 11. She says to him, come, my beloved, and let us go forth into the field. Let's lodge in the villages. Let's get up early to the vineyards. Let's see if the vine flourish, whether the tender grapes appear and the pomegranate buds. and that is where I will give you my love. Wow, this is huge. You'll see a total change in the bride's attitude. And this is what has been happening over the last 2,000 years. When it talks about he's waiting for the fullness of the Gentiles, the word fullness is wrong. He's waiting for the maturity of the Gentiles. You don't reap a harvest until it's ready. The bride hasn't been ready. She's been immature for the last 2,000 years, and we are finally reaching maturity where he can marry his bride. And then we conclude with chapter 8, and I want you to notice this time in verse 8, it says, who is this that's coming up from the wilderness, leaning upon her beloved? Guess what? It's not Solomon. It is the shepherd and his bride. And then what do we see when we go down to, let's go to verse 12. And here she is saying, my vineyard, which is mine. Remember in chapter 1, she wasn't taking care of it. Now she claims that she needs to take care of it, and it's before me, so she's in her vineyard. And then she says this, you, O Solomon, you must have 1,000, and those that keep the fruit thereof 200. In other words, that king, that human king is still there, and she's doing what she's supposed to be doing from a citizen point of view. But then she turns to the shepherd and says, hey, you that dwell in the gardens, the companions hearken to your voice. They hear and obey. And she says, cause me to hear it. And then she says, make haste, my beloved, to be like a roe or a young hart, not upon the mountains of Bether of separation, but on the mountain of spices, which directly refers to Mount Moriah. This is basically Jerusalem. This is where Messiah dies. And she finally understands what that meant, and now she gets to work. So as far as end times, I just want all of you to realize the days we're living in is the days when the bride finally matures. She's no longer worried about herself. She's more worried about the harvest, because the harvest has come and the Father's looking for laborers in the harvest. So may you all get to work. Bless you. Thank you, Pastor Joe and Susan.